Guy Penrod spent 14 years standing next to Bill Gaither on some of the most watched stages in Southern gospel music. And for most of that time, he refused to sing one particular song. Not because he disliked it, and not over any dispute with Gaither himself, but for a reason so personal that almost nobody in the audience ever guessed it. Guy Wayne Penrod was born on March 2nd, 1963, in Texas, and religion wasn't something his family visited on Sundays. It was the structure everything else in the household was built around. His father worked as a minister, so church sat at the center of daily life rather than at the edge of the week. And Guy grew up absorbing hymns the way other kids absorb nursery rhymes, long before he understood what those songs were doing to him. That upbringing shaped a voice that would eventually stop rooms full of people cold. In 1994, Guy joined the Gaither Vocal Band, and for anyone who grew up on those homecoming recordings, his arrival felt inevitable, like a piece that had been missing without anyone quite realizing it. Songs including Redeemed, Going in Style, and I'm Not Giving Up gave audiences something to hold on to during hard seasons. And Guy delivered them with a weight that went past performance. People didn't just enjoy his singing, they believed him. And in gospel music, that distinction is the only one that really counts. From 1994 until 2008, Guy stood alongside Bill Gaither, David Phelps, Wes Hampton, and Mark Lowry through hundreds of recordings and countless homecoming events, giving audiences everything he had, night after night. And through all of it, one Gaither composition remained something he consistently avoided. That song was He Touched Me, and understanding Guy's silence around it requires going back to where it came from. Bill Gaither wrote it in 1963, as a young schoolteacher trying to put words to an experience of grace he had spent his whole life hearing about, but never quite managed to articulate himself. What came out wasn't a theological argument. It was closer to testimony, a direct account of a God who reaches into human suffering and makes contact. The song moved through churches and Christian music circles for years, and in 1972 it reached a different level of American culture when Elvis Presley recorded it for a gospel album that went on to win a Grammy Award. Long before Guy Penrod ever sang a note of it professionally, his own father was already singing He Touched Me in that small Texas church. And he wasn't merely performing it. He was preaching the idea underneath it, the notion of a God who moves toward pain rather than observing it from a distance. For the Penrod family, that song carried a weight that only comes when music has been lived inside rather than simply performed. Guy watched his father deliver those words with the conviction that belongs only to someone speaking from personal experience. And that memory is exactly why, the first time Bill Gaither brought the song into rehearsal and turned to Guy expecting him to take the lead, Guy quietly stepped back instead. There was no argument and no scene, just a quiet admission that he wasn't able to sing that particular song yet. Bill Gaither has said in interviews that some of the strongest performances come from artists carrying weight the audience never sees. But what Guy was protecting wasn't a performance technique. It was something that hadn't finished healing. He understood from watching his father minister that certain things shouldn't be presented publicly before they've genuinely been processed. And in gospel music, testimony and performance are not the same thing. Only one of them holds up over time. The fuller picture comes into focus once you know what was happening in Guy's personal life during those same years. His father's health had begun declining while Guy was out on the road, and distance is one of the costs every touring musician accepts. But when the family member in question is the pastor who shaped your entire understanding of faith and music, that distance carries a weight touring schedules never account for. The elder Penrod's ministry never reached a national stage, no recordings, no television appearances, nothing that would put his name in Christian music circles. What it had instead was integrity built through decades of steady presence and a life that held up under close examination. When his father's health worsened and the losses that come with decline began adding up, He Touched Me became something Guy couldn't separate from grief. Not because the song itself is sorrowful, it isn't, but because it belonged so completely to his father that singing it himself felt like wearing something not yet fully handed down to him. Bill Gaither, to his credit, never pressed the issue, and that restraint says something about the kind of ministry he built. Gaither has spent his career operating on the understanding that gospel music carries the weight of real lives, and that the artists performing it bring that weight along whether the audience realizes it or not. He recognized when someone needed time instead of a conversation, and he gave Guy exactly that, though nobody in the Gaither organization could have predicted how long that time would need to stretch. What changed things wasn't the passing of enough calendar time, and it wasn't grief simply fading into something manageable. The shift came from a conversation with his wife, Guy Penrod, who has stood beside him through every stretch of his ministry while raising 8 children during the years he spent traveling, recording, and eventually building a solo career after leaving the Gaither vocal band in 2008. One evening, Angie told her husband something simple, that his father's relationship with that song hadn't ended with his father's life. It had carried forward into Guy himself, into his voice and his understanding of ministry, and that every time Guy sang those words with genuine belief, his father's ministry kept going. Not as tribute, but as a real extension of what his father had started decades earlier in that small Texas church. Guy has described that conversation as the moment his refusal ended, though not because grief resolved on some kind of schedule, since anyone who has lost a parent knows it never really does. What changed was that grief stopped standing between him and the song, and instead became the reason the song mattered. The first time he performed He Touched Me with the Gaither vocal band afterward, people who were present that night have described something different in the performance from the opening note. Not louder or more technically polished, just more real. The specific kind of real that shows up when someone has personally paid for every word they're delivering. For longtime fans of Guy Penrod's ministry, this story reaches past biography into something worth sitting with. Christian music today often gets measured by things that have nothing to do with what actually makes it Christian. Streaming totals, production polish, chart position, and against that backdrop, a man who refused to sing a beloved song because he hadn't finished grieving his father represents something the industry rarely makes room for anymore. Gospel music, at its best, functions as testimony rather than entertainment, bearing witness to something true about a person's own encounter with faith. And Guy's years of silence show that he understood the difference and chose the harder, truer option, even when it would have been easier to simply perform. He Touched Me isn't just one composition among many in Bill Gaither's catalog. It's widely regarded as the song that established him as a serious writer within Southern gospel and broader Christian music. Gaither has spoken about writing it quickly, almost as though it arrived rather than being constructed, and about watching it travel through American religious culture in ways he never anticipated, including through Elvis Presley's Grammy-winning recording, which reached listeners traditional gospel channels never would have touched. But by his own account, what has meant the most to Gaither over the decades isn't the famous version. It's hearing the song from people for whom the words are genuinely autobiographical. People who can point to a specific loss or a specific renewal and say honestly, this is about exactly what happened to me. When Guy Penrod finally sang it, he joined that group, not as an interpreter honoring someone else's composition, but as a witness reporting from somewhere real. Now at 61, Guy carries both the voice and everything that voice has lived through, and the two are no longer separable. The song he once refused now gets sung, by every account, without hesitation. And that movement from private grief to public testimony is exactly the kind of story gospel music has always been built to hold. Whether Guy has ever sat his own 8 children down and told them what that song cost him remains an open question. And somewhere in that family, there may be a voice that eventually carries the same weight forward.